Hello, good morning, and welcome to the Capital Call with the Millegan brothers. I'm Quinn Millegan.
And I'm Drew Millegan.
We're both brothers and managing partners for the Woodworth Contrarian Fund. And, when this is released, of course, today is the second Friday after the close. It'll be Cinco de Mayo, so happy Cinco de Mayo. I hope you have some tequila today. Maybe not if you're driving to work, though.
The anniversary of the Great Mexican Battle. How appropriate.
Yeah. But let's get into it. I mean, and by the way, if you don't know, you got to wait till the end. For this day in economic history, got a fun one for you that Drew hasn't heard yet.
Yep, and I strive to keep it that way, so I'm more genuinely surprised.
And one thing I wanted to mention today, the job numbers actually came out better than expected. Unemployment remains at 4.2%, relatively low. And one thing I noticed, a lot of the effects of tariffs somewhat seem to be concentrated. Is that a good way to put it? It's not like systemic.
Oh, I think that's a great way to characterize it, Quinn. What's interesting about these tariffs in particular is that the U.S. economy is a lot more diversified than it was when tariffs were more common, particularly in services, which are somewhat difficult to place trade restrictions on. For example, if you outsource to a call center in India, how do you tariff that type of employment or contractor work? It's a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
As the economy has become more and more service-driven, that means that the actual inputs of the basic resources that are being affected by these tariffs is a little bit less. Now, it's got, of course, knock-on effects that affect the entire economy, and particularly things like food. But it's interesting to see how the effects differ. You've got somewhat of a natural economic experiment here, which, much as a lot of people would rather it didn't happen, is still something which we can learn something from.
Yeah. And that being said, the S&P actually had the longest win streak since 2004. And now that being said, today, the S&P finally just barely broke even from the losses associated with the so-called Liberation Day.
Yep.
With tariffs on April 2nd. So, take that with a grain of salt, right?
It's interesting how a rebound like this happens after a big drop. I noticed that a lot of folks were saying that one of the interesting aspects of tariffs is that they do destroy value. Just from the lack of cooperation across large groups of people. And this kind of manifests in terms of economic growth is it could be a steep decline and then a return to growth, but you still wouldn't be as high as you would have been if you hadn't instituted the tariffs in the first place.
Yeah.
So even though there's value destruction, that doesn't mean you can't still grow after the fact. You just won't be quite as rich as you would have been otherwise.
I always like being a little bit richer.
Yeah, come back when you're a little richer. I don't know how many people will get that reference, but we made it. More interestingly, also, I did notice, and I hope the market had noticed, that GDP numbers also came out. Now, these GDP numbers showed a contraction for the first time in quite a long time, several years. But if you look at the underlying numbers, the final line GDP wasn't that negative. A big part of the reason why is a lot of the contraction came from negative 4.8% from exports contracting. So if you look at the other components of GDP, government spending, consumers spending, all that, it actually remained relatively strong, which is pretty reflective of how the economy in general is kind of in a holding pattern right now. People are waiting for the other shoe to drop to a certain degree on consumers. Because consumer confidence is just in the toilet right now. Everybody and their grandmother is expecting a recession.
Well, Temu stopped all direct from China shipments, and so you can't get your cheap goods because the de minimis loophole just ended.
For those not aware, the de minimis loophole applies to products under $800 in value. So that's part of the reason why you were able to get a lot of cheap goods out of China.
Because you could just ship directly to the consumer. You didn't have to worry with import duties or warehouses or anything. which directly connected small businesses in China to consumers in the United States.
Strangely.
Yeah.
And it's been a rewiring of the global trade system. I noticed Apple came out with earnings, for example, and Apple is, of course, known for their vast production network in China. But they've also shifted a lot of that production to places like India and Vietnam. So one of the things they announced they were doing is they announced that their iPhone and iPad production, they were going to shift over to India and Vietnam, at least for the product that was destined to be shipped to the U.S. market. And instead, they're going to be shifting that Chinese production to other markets globally so that they can kind of arbitrage those taxes. So in that way, they don't have to fully pull back from their production in China. It just means they can't ship direct from China to the U.S. People forget the rest of the world has grown. You know, there are consumers in India and Indonesia and Australia that are not necessarily subject to as high of tariffs, and especially not that, 300% figure from China. It's not exactly 300%, but it's around there. It's high enough that I can make that kind of generalization, which is not great.
Yeah.
And you're starting to see this as earnings come out from all over different sectors of the market. In particular, it's been interesting to watch the oil companies as they've started to come out. Exxon and Shell, for example, just recently came out, and oil is one of those things that everybody in the market watches. It used to be even more critical to the economy before you had alternatives for energy supplies, before natural gas became a big thing, for instance. But it's been trading down around $60. And WTI crude is actually below that right now. It's below around like $57, $58 here in the US. But if you look at the Brent crude, it's actually at $61.25 right now, which is also still low for Brent crude. Brent crude typically trades at a slight premium. Comes from, and it's European essentially. And Brent crude is the prices that OPEC uses to benchmark their production and break-even levels. And what everybody is watching right now in the oil and gas sector is what OPEC is going to do. Because I don't know if you knew this, but OPEC is actually meeting tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Tomorrow, as of recording, it'll be 2 days ago, and the news will already be out, and this news will be stale, of course. You can go and look and see what they said for yourself. But
hopefully they didn't, burn anything down.
Right. I mean, the part of the reason oil is down right now is there are two reasons. One, the tariffs are causing a lot of demand destruction, or at least they're expecting there to be a lot of demand destruction. So prices getting cheaper at the pump, not necessarily always a good thing. It tends to be a recession indicator. But the other component here is that there's speculation that Saudi Arabia has kind of gotten fed up with a little bit of the cheating that goes on in OPEC. In terms of supply caps. And I'll just give a little rundown of exactly what OPEC is for those that have heard the term but aren't necessarily aware of what it is. It is an international oil price fixing cartel, to put it bluntly.
And what's it stand for?
Oil producing something countries.
Equalizing countries. I don't know.
I forget the exact acronym. I just call it OPEC. It's just always been OPEC to me. So the point is it's a consortium of oil producing countries. And there's both OPEC and then there's OPEC Plus, which are countries that aren't officially part of OPEC, but tend to set their policies in lockstep with OPEC and kind of have a little bit of influence on what goes on. Russia, for example, is an OPEC Plus country. But that meeting is where all the different country members of OPEC have their price fixing negotiations and determine, hey, what do we want the price of oil to be, and can we cut back on production to target that? Can we do other things? Saudi Arabia in particular is kind of notorious because they've been quoted as saying that they can continue to produce and profit just fine, even down to like $20 a barrel on oil, which hasn't been seen in years and years. And there are actually members of OPEC that can produce profitably down to like $5.
That's crazy.
Yeah, Kuwait and Iraq in particular are just very, very low cost producers. And even the UAE, Iran, and Saudi can produce down to $10. Just going by the estimates that I actually have in front of me from The Economist. whereas the U.S., as a non-OPEC country, can only produce profitably down to about $35 for the majority of its producers. Although a lot of producers can't even produce profitably down at like $55, which is part of the reason why watching those levels has been so important. A lot of the frackers, the guys where they go in and they use like horizontal drilling techniques and they crack open the rock with really high pressure water. Those are more expensive techniques, so they tend to be less profitable, and they tend to be among the first that get hit when oil prices start dropping. And then above that, you get things like oil sands, which can also, and like really, really high sulfur crude, like Venezuela has, can be difficult to deal with. But the internal politics of OPEC are interesting because they're made up of a lot of oil producing countries, but these countries, although they say they coordinate, they don't always stick to those coordinated goals because there's a very big incentive for any individual member of OPEC to cheat.
Yeah.
And anybody who's familiar with the prisoner's dilemma will know what I'm talking about here. But, there's no enforcement mechanism for any of the countries to be punished in the case that they're like, well, they're targeting this price, but if I produce just like a little bit more, I'll make more money. And I'm betting that those other guys will underproduce just to keep the price level low. So I'm just going to do this. And, places like Kazakhstan are notorious for overproducing. And also Iraq in particular is also notorious for being an overproducer and not keeping the production targets. So what the speculation for Saturday is that Saudi has basically just gotten fed up with this. And they're just going to continue to produce more despite, what it'll do to the price, and it'll send a price shock in. And as an added bonus, Saudi can produce down to $10. So it's... and profitably produce down to like $20. $10 is the break even. So the speculation is that Saudi will overproduce both to punish the guys that have been overproducing. Kazakhstan in particular is not a formal member of OPEC and will be hurt at a much higher price level than a lot of the other OPEC members. And it has the added benefit of maybe driving, the frackers that made the U.S. oil independent out of business. There was a long period of time, people might remember, where oil was kept very low priced, in part because OPEC was overproducing to try and put the U.S. out of business, and it didn't work. The U.S. frackers essentially just got more efficient, which is part of the reason why a price-setting cartel doesn't work if you don't have coordination of some of the world's largest oil producers. So everybody's watching this with bated breath right now.
Are they as effective as the maple syrup cartel?
The maple syrup cartel has been known to break some heads. Yeah. That maple syrup reserve is no joke. The Canadians, they know war crimes. So I'm really not familiar with a Canadian oil cartel, but I do know that they do have the maple syrup reserves up there.
By the way, I did Google it. OPEC stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Fantastic. Fun fact I did learn about OPEC is that Qatar, it's pronounced Qatar, used to be a core member of OPEC until about 2019. They left. Would you care to take a stab at why?
Does it have anything to do with either slave labor or the World Cup?
No, it does not. But good guesses. They are known for their slave labor there.
Yeah. Maybe because they disagreed with the price?
No. Qatar is a world-leading exporter of natural gas. So they withdrew from OPEC in order to focus on their natural gas production. I'm sure it's part of what's got Saudi Arabia just kind of generally miffed at Qatar. Qatar's also usually historically been a kind of bridge between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who of course hate each other, but everybody in the Middle East hates each other. I'm amazed that Iran and Saudi Arabia are still coordinating on OPEC. But I guess, price fixing makes strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
Also, in my digging, I did find a few interesting tidbits. The Trump administration's foreign policy goals have been an enigma to many people,
to say the least.
But they do come out with some coherent strategies, and there has been a recent announcement where people seem to have forgotten that they did announce that they want all oil companies out of Venezuela on pain of sanction penalties by May 27th, which is this month.
Yeah. Well, they also, this was more recent. He made a statement that any country that buys oil from Iran will not be able to do business with the United States as well, which is largely like India, also Korea, South Korea, and Japan, and Bulgaria, Romania.
Yeah. India's an interesting case because they don't have a lot of oil production in India, but they have a lot of consumption. So there's a lot of refineries in India, but not necessarily original production of crude. So they kind of just buy from whoever will sell it to them. You know, it's kind of hard for India to say, no, we won't buy from you because they have no reserves.
Yeah. Well, I remember when everybody was not buying oil from Russia, suddenly India hops on and it's like, oh, I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. They'll take the discounted oil. They don't care where it comes from. India's got a long and proud tradition of neutrality, which allows them to do business with whoever they want. At times, it's a big strategic advantage.
Yeah.
That reminds me. You saw the news out of India where there was that big terrorist attack in Kashmir.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was talk of them. They cut off all trade, and then there was talk of going to war. Nothing's materialized yet. It could be bad, and it's a little bit of a foreign policy blind spot for Western countries because people forget that Pakistan and India both have nukes.
Yeah. I always forget that Pakistan has nukes. I remember India, but then it's like, oh, Pakistan used to be part of India and they had nukes, and now they both have nukes.
Yep. They both equally have the ability to launch a limited nuclear exchange, whatever that means. It could be quite bad, but no, it's very, very difficult to get news out of Kashmir. For quite a while now, there's been a bit of a media blackout out of there from India. And again, it's a bit of a blind spot. So you don't necessarily know the specifics of what's going on there because people aren't paying attention to it. But I digress. This is not something we have a particularly deep breadth of knowledge about. It's just something that I know that people are not necessarily paying super close attention to that could be a kind of stalking horse. That's a lot of people that would be going to war if that happened. And also, Apple produces a lot of their stuff there. So if you're a shareholder of Apple, you should care about what happens in India.
And conveniently, before all this trade war business, they were already transitioning from China to India. And
Vietnam, don't forget about Vietnam.
And Vietnam, and diversifying, which was probably a good move.
Yes. Again, the globe is a much more diversified place than it used to be. So tariffs have a little, you can do a bit of arbitrage and still kind of keep your production in different places. But yeah, that's oil. It drives the world. I did.
Pun intended.
Yeah. It literally drives the world. I did find it interesting. Norway is actually a fairly low cost producer and can keep some modicum of production online, even in the worst case scenario of like $5 oil. There is a segment of producers in Norway that can theoretically continue to operate above break even.
Did you see at all what the cost was for production coming out of Alaska?
Again, I didn't have a breakdown of exactly where producers were that were lowest cost in the U.S. I would assume generally when you're talking low cost producers, you're talking like very shallow wells where you can essentially just stick a straw in the ground and it just comes gushing out. In the Middle East, that's what they do. That's why they're so low cost in Kuwait. They stick a straw in the ground, and then when it runs out, they just pump some seawater in to keep the pressure up. They're basically just sitting on top of a giant natural lake of oil just below the surface. I am not that familiar with exactly what kind of quality of crude comes out of Alaska, though. I just
wonder if it's similar to like Russia's or Norway's, just because geographically
it is on the Arctic. I mean, you're talking Barrow was recently named to a native name that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, not because I don't believe in it, but because I will butcher it. So I'm just going to call it Barrow. And it's, the Arctic in theory could have a lot of unproven reserves, and that's been a bone of contention. I remember the Russians actually planted a flag on the North Pole on the seabed with an unmanned underwater vehicle, just to make a point, because they want to stake their claim. It's unclear. The Arctic is a very shallow ocean, so it's unclear where the continental shelf ends, which, for those not aware, the continental shelf, I didn't think I'd get into this. The continental shelf is how countries determine the limits of their exclusive economic zone outside of it, within their territorial waters, or just outside of their territorial waters.
The shelf is theoretically the actual continent. It's just part of it is underwater. So it's like a shallower part of the ocean that's not the ocean.
Right. The geopolitical problem for the Arctic in this case is that as the Arctic ice melts, it wasn't really that big of a deal before this, because the Arctic Ocean is relatively shallow and it's not really clear where the continental shelf ends, which in theory, because all the countries are so close around the Arctic shelf, around the Arctic Ocean, it's kind of like unclear which parts are owned by Canada, which parts are owned by the US, which parts are owned by Russia, and then there's Norway and Denmark, and I believe Iceland may get a small chunk. I don't think it's like in the Arctic Ocean proper, but Denmark owns Greenland, so although
not for long.
Yeah, I'm sure certain people would like it to be the U.S., which is actually kind of probably part of the reason why it's so alluring to want to stake a claim in Greenland, just because the Arctic ice is melting. It's potentially a conflict point.
Yeah.
But I do find it, I can bring up a different, there is a different aspect of oil, which is actually interesting in that it's not, some people say that it's going to run out or it's going to be replaced, or, like you shouldn't be watching it that closely anymore. I would say all of these positions are kind of wrong in different ways.
Yeah.
One, you never really effectively deplete a resource. You just kind of take out so much of it that the stuff that's remaining isn't really worth taking out.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it this way: you get the last remaining barrel of oil, and that price of that barrel is going to be so expensive, no one wants to use it.
Right. I mean, this is probably why the whales are still alive. Like as whales became more scarce, they had to find an alternative source of heating oil, which is part of the reason why we use oil out of the ground today. But those last whales just weren't worth the effort to go after, even at elevated prices. They found replacements. And the same would essentially be true with oil. I mean, we've started to find replacements already. A lot of renewables, for example, are already cheaper than oil, coal, or natural gas. Solar with battery really appears to be one of the clear winners in this situation, where the batteries just keep getting cheaper and higher capacity.
And it's just so cheap to just absorb energy from the sun. You just sit there and do nothing.
You're essentially turning them in. They're essentially big giant leaves that just spit out juice that you have to clean every now and then, but especially in like more southern areas. But as solar panels have gotten cheaper, it's making more and more sense to use them at even more and more northern latitudes, or even here in Oregon, where, this for like 6 months out of the year, it gets quite dreary. Yeah, I don't know if people know, but it gets cloudy in Oregon. I may be wearing a Hawaiian shirt, but that's just because, it's the first few days of 70 plus degrees out here.
It was 80 yesterday.
That was upsetting. I don't like it when it's warm this early. It means that we might get a bad fire season.
I do like Four Seasons, though. It's nice.
It is nice.
Beautiful place. You should visit.
Yeah, the Four Seasons Hotel, right? We're not talking about Oregon. It hardly ever snows here on the valley floor. So it's the oil markets are not zero-sum markets, is what I would say. Prices will, and I've actually also seen pieces where people expect oil price to actually decline over time as certain uses get phased out of oil. It's kind of like, the last one out, turn off the lights kind of situation. If oil consumption goes down at a rapid clip, what'll happen is you'll have all this capacity that is still online for refining and mining, and that capacity is already built. So what'll happen is it'll drop below the price at which it makes sense to build new petroleum refining facilities. But at the same time, those refining facilities that are already built won't just shut down, because the price that it makes sense for them to totally shut down is actually even lower. It's in the floor. So those refineries will keep pumping out. And if demand keeps dropping, we won't build new refineries, but they'll keep those refineries online, which means they'll essentially just be constantly overproducing for years and years and years.
And you know, and Drew and I have disagreed somewhat on part of this, but I'm of the contention that we will, both with vehicles, but also energy sources, I think it's more likely that instead of like, you know, we run out of a resource or something outcompetes something entirely, we'll slowly get a much more diversified energy resource environment. So, you know, it's like with cars, I don't think EVs are going to take over entirely. I mean, you get to a point where it's like fossil fuels are so cheap while being extremely inefficient that there's a lot of room for improvement that just hasn't been necessary until you get something like EVs coming in cheaper, more efficient. And you might see some huge gains, but a certain point that will incentivize people to get more efficient internal combustion engines, or, you know, I don't know, maybe figure out a better way to use hydrogen, which would be cool.
I'm still skeptical on hydrogen.
I'm skeptical too. I just think you know, you get the roar of an internal combustion engine, but you also it's a better fuel source than you know, gas potentially. I mean, depends how you define better. But
my problem with hydrogen is it's very expensive to contain,
and that's the carnal sin.
I love hydrogen because it's one of those, it's the smallest element on the periodic table, which means no matter what you build your tank out of, a little bit of hydrogen is going to leak through. You know, it's like you're trying to build a glass to hold water, except your glass is actually a glass net, which means the water's constantly leaking out of the holes.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to contain.
Very difficult to contain. There's always a lot of line loss, so to speak, when you try to transport it.
But you have almost no emissions from a hydrogen vehicle, which is interesting, and it's very efficient. The problem is containing it.
Right, and the problem is also producing it in an economic manner. You know, a lot of people source like hydrogen and natural gas and such from like defunct oil wells. For example, there's been a lot of adaptive reuse of oil wells for storage and mining of hydrogen. And it's you know, it's interesting. I'm sure a lot of people thought they would cap these oils and never reopen them again, but now they've got different uses. You can even store carbon, use them as carbon sinks. Once you take the oil out, you've got geologic features that are favorable to storing carbon still in the ground. They're just empty now, so you can pump carbon dioxide back into them, and they won't leak out of the ground, or at least they won't leak out very fast.
Yeah. I mean, hey, maybe down the road you get genetic engineering that is good enough that you can manufacture whale blubber in a controlled environment infinitely.
Grow whale blubber in vats so that I can screw it. I'd like to eat a whale burger whenever I want with no moral implications. That sounds amazing.
Now that I think of it, why couldn't they do that?
You can. I mean,
probably is not cost effective.
There's vat-grown hamburgers out there right now.
Oh, yeah.
That they've started making. And I really think that in the long run, it seems to make sense that would be the future of basically all meat.
And they bring back the dire wolf, allegedly, and they're going to bring back the woolly mammoth. I can't wait to try a mammoth burger.
They made a woolly mouse, and they did not bring back a dire wolf. They did a crossbreed of the dire wolf with a type of canine that is not actually, it's questionable whether it's actually close enough related to the dire wolf that you could technically even call it a dire wolf.
Well, okay, that's why I say allegedly. I mean, they claim that it is so genetically similar that it is a dire wolf because they utilized a descendant species of the dire wolf or whatever.
I saw claims by John Green on his blog and vlog that it's very much not. It's something totally new. I don't know if you've ever watched SciShow or Hank Green or anything like that.
Well, you know, I can dream that we'll get Jurassic Park someday soon.
I mean, there's not in theory. There's nothing really stopping us from doing so. There's just a question as to whether even if you brought back a lineage that's genetically identical, to the historic fossil population, is it really the same population? Because once it's living, it's kind of no longer the same thing. It's being introduced to a new environment and adapts in response to that. So
that's kind of a similar philosophical question as to whether if I invent what do you call it? Transportation? No, like Star Trek, where I go from one place to another. What's
transporters?
Transporters. If I'm transported,
it's just a suicide booth.
Yeah, but for all intents and purposes, the new created me in the new location has the same memories as me before I was destroyed in the transporter.
Yeah.
Is that the same person or is it a clone?
This is the philosophical question, which we are not qualified to answer, but is fun to think about because, you're really not really the same person. I know, like, there were episodes of Star Trek that explored this many times where they had the transporter malfunction and there be an accidental clone, which kind of gave away the game. Like, the transporter is not sending you to a new location. What it's doing is it's dematerializing you, i.e. killing you, and then taking the scan from that dematerialization process, transmitting that information in they call it like an energy beam or something like that, but it might as well be a radio transmission, and then sending that copy of you to be rematerialized or printed at the new site. But in the process, you have essentially just incinerated yourself, and the new you on the other end has no way of even knowing that and didn't really even experience it. So there's a religious question, I suppose. Does the soul go with the body?
Yeah.
So it's luckily not something we have to ponder.
I mean, I think it'd be kind of cool.
I think it would. I would be the old crotchety man taking the shuttle down, even if it has a high chance of killing me. I'd rather take uncertain death over certain death, I think.
Speaking of cool space type of stuff.
Yes.
Do you see that the administration, the Space Force, is going to work on that they want to have a directive to make an orbital spacecraft carrier? First of all, that would cost so much money, but if it were possible, that would be kind of cool. No?
I'm not qualified to speak on exactly the specifics of what this thing is. I've seen, if people want to see a really good science commentary as to what the Space Force is proposing, I can't recommend enough. Go look at like the Scott Manley channel. He's a Scottish astrophysicist living in California, but he does a lot of really in-depth commentary on projects like this. But
hopefully you can understand his Scottish accent.
Yeah, exactly. It's hello. He started out, I think, making like Kerbal Space Program game videos, but it's an interesting concept. The thing is, here's the thing. I can't speak to the specifics of this project, but what I can speak to is the changing dynamics of economics of space. And what has changed fundamentally in the space area as like an area of industry is that the cost of launch has declined so rapidly, so fast with the advent of reusable rockets that you can afford to do weird stuff in space.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get cheaper. Theoretically, there's probably a lower barrier as to how cheap it can actually get just because of the sheer amount of energy involved in sending stuff up to space. But now that you're not throwing away what used to happen, the reason it's gotten so cheaper is that it used to be that you had a rocket, you would design it, and you would throw away everything but the payload. You would have a rocket multiple stages. The first stage would separate, fall into the ocean, and explode. And then you'd have a second stage, which is now lighter, which can now go further on less rocket propellant. That's why you've got different stages of a rocket, because you're trying to overcome the rocket equation. And you now have this lighter stage that is going up, and it's going up, and it's going up, and now you have to ditch that stage because now you're out of fuel in that stage too. And that stage separates and crashes back down through the atmosphere and probably explodes, which is fun, but not very economically efficient. Imagine, if you will, you're driving your car, and in order to get to your destination, halfway there, you have to jettison the back of your car, and now you're driving a motorcycle. And then you get really close to your destination, and you have to jettison all of your parts, and now you're on a self-propelled scooter. And then in order to get back home, you have to buy a whole new car. That's essentially what we used to have to do with rocket ships.
It's expensive.
You have to buy a new car anytime you want to go somewhere. What SpaceX did that I think it maybe sometimes doesn't get enough credit for is that by reusing that first phase, you're now only having to buy like a third of a car to get to space instead of the whole car, and they can reuse that bottom component plus some components at the top bit. And that's also why people get excited about like Starship, because that would be fully reusable. There are some components that still would fall off, like they do. Have you ever heard the term hot staging?
I don't think I have.
Hot staging is fun because it's basically just a fancy way to say you turn on the second stage engine without actually separating, and the resulting force and ferocity of the rocket essentially blows away the connections to the first stage. So you're essentially blowing off a section of the rocket when you light your engine. It's good fun. You have to have like an ablative panel to protect the lower section of the rocket if you want to reuse it.
Good fun. You've done it before?
Definitely, always. Every time I go to space, I do this. I've seen the discourse getting really frustrated around Elon Musk in particular for understandable reasons, but the underlying principles are sound.
Yeah.
It does have the potential to get us to space very, very quickly and in high quantities, high volumes.
Yeah. Speaking of Elon Musk, he's been a hot topic over the last couple of months, but he's been under hot water. The Tesla board was allegedly looking to replace him, but then they refuted it just because he said he was not spending enough time with the company.
I'm sure he's not spending enough time with a lot of things. He has recently decided to leave the government and Doge, and one would think that might be part of the reason he chose to do that.
Yeah.
Is that the board might be giving him pressure. There's a question as to what will happen with Doge with him not there. Doge actually did used to be a different department of the government that was pre-existing.
The U.S. Digital Service, created by Obama.
Yeah, before it got renamed to Doge, Department of Government Efficiency. So, questions abound as to what will happen there.
One thing I wanted to bring up was in the realm of venture capital. So ChatGPT, part of OpenAI, is they announced that they're going to do a partnership with Shopify. And, quite frankly, I don't even really care about whatever the partnership is. But one of the things that people have been worried about, the saying goes in Silicon Valley that any startup that becomes successful eventually becomes an advertising company.
Yeah.
I mean, every single one. I mean, Google's a big advertising company, Facebook, all of those big ones.
Advertising has also been a bright spot in the economy, by the way. It's what outperformed in Alphabet's recent earnings. Alphabet is the parent company of Google, by the way.
Yeah. But, the company has said, no, we're not going to become an advertising company. No, yada, yada. They always say that. Google's motto was don't be evil, and then eventually they got rid of that motto. But ChatGPT, if they could actually monetize themselves as an ad space, kind of like what Google does, the value they're projected to have like 1 billion users. And the engagement you have of users of ChatGPT is insane. So that's, I guess, probably part of the thesis of why it's such a valuable private company.
I do find it interesting the direction that ChatGPT has gone, but I also find it almost more interesting how fast it's been adopted. Like you talk to somebody on the street now and, you ask them a question, they're just as liable to ask ChatGPT what it thinks.
Yeah.
As they are to Google it. And frankly, if you're an older person, you're more likely to Google things, which has been why everybody's been very worried about Google, because they were behind the game in getting into AI search.
And now they're being subject to all this antitrust and yada yada. They got to break up Chrome. And I've said this for years. In fact, I wrote an article about it in 2018 I forgot about.
Amazing.
That all these antitrust lawsuits, they should break up Amazon. If they're going to target any company that's an alleged monopoly, the biggest one and most effective one would be Amazon. And that's simply because AWS, Amazon Web Services, subsidizes the entire company that runs essentially at a loss and outcompetes everybody else because they have Amazon Web Services subsidizing the entire company. And like, okay, Apple, Google, Facebook, I see the arguments to why antitrust lawsuits should litigate them, but the arguments are a bit less shaky. It's like they're saying that Google should break up the Chrome browser. Now, I
don't know how you do that.
Well, right. I've actually seen arguments as to why that would actually hinder competition because Google subsidizes Chromium, which is the framework that Chrome is built on, because they don't really make any money off of Chromium, but competitors like Microsoft Edge browser also uses Chromium, and there's several others that are built off of Chromium. That is a service that is subsidized by Google that encourages competition with themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's arguable whether or not it actually does anything for the monopoly that Google probably has for breaking up Chrome. I mean, it seems so ineffective.
Now, was that part of their antitrust argument?
Whose?
Google's. Do you know?
Well, the DOJ said it ordered them to break away Chrome.
Okay, but Chromium itself, it seems like that would be a key. Well, we don't have to look it up right now. I mean, the point is that the DOJ is not necessarily going after
Chrome is Chromium.
Yeah. Well,
the DOJ just wanted them to break away their browser arm.
Right. No, I know, but the fact that they do operate, I'm saying the argument that you just put forward is a very good pro don't break up Google argument.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sure they did in some way.
But you raise a very good point because, I mean, you point out that Amazon is something that could very easily be broken up. And my response to that is you and what Department of Justice? Ultimately, these are political decisions at the end of the day, unfortunately, just because of how massive these companies are. Somebody has to lobby for them to be broken up. You have to hear these arguments in court and have to spend money on lawyers for that. And these companies also have very good lawyers to argue against breaking them up, which means that in practice, what the DOJ usually goes after for like antitrust type lawsuits typically isn't always the really, really big guys, but it's like the guys that are like a step down from that.
But the ones that won't put up a fight.
Yeah, the guys they can bag and tag pretty easily.
Yeah.
They're fairly confident they won't lose.
But the antitrust actions of the DOJ have significantly reduced from like 100 years ago.
You mean when it was formed? Good old Teddy Roosevelt with his trust busting?
Yeah, well, okay, and investors forget this every single time. Mm-hmm. But when a company is broken up as a monopoly, the investors make, pardon my French, shitloads of money after it's broken up.
It's a massive value creation event. If I owned a company and they got broken up by trust, I hope it happens fast, very swiftly. I hope they announce that they're breaking them up, and a few months later, they're broken up.
Yeah, it's like Rockefeller didn't become as what he made a boatload of money after they broke up Standard Oil. It's like AT&T in the 80s. When they broke it up, investors made boatloads of money. They said, oh, this isn't something you can break up. There has to be one unified telecommunications company. Then they broke it up and you saw competition and investors made tons of money.
Yep. It's amazing how that happens almost every time. There's an old story about Rockefeller in his biography where he... And the name of the biography escapes me, and I'm going to regret not being able to cite it specifically in this podcast. But,
anything to do with the Rockefeller salute?
I believe the Rockefeller salute was included in that book. But
famous picture where he's, giving reporters of the bird.
The story goes that Rockefeller was a relatively devout man, and he was out golfing with his pastor, as you do back in the early 20th century, and what his pastor was asking him, Mr. Rockefeller, aren't you, I know your company's being broken up And tomorrow it's going to be open for trading with all these new companies. These are now like Chevron and Exxon. And he turns to his pastor as he's golfing, and he says, Pastor, if you have any brains, you'll buy every goddamn share of Standard Oil you can before that breakup goes through. And legend says it that he golfed the best game of his entire life that day. And true to his prediction, Standard Oil's price was depressed going into this, and then after they were broken up, all the companies that came out of that soared. If you had held Standard Oil, and Rockefeller got shares of all of these companies after they were broken up.
It's not like they took the company from him.
He was richer than he'd ever been in his life after these companies were broken up. He had his fingers in every pie, and it's why the Rockefeller family remained wealthy for multiple generations after this. There's a reason there's Rockefeller Center and Rockefeller Plaza and the Rockefeller Building and all that. So it's one of those things where it's for their own good to a certain extent. And I think that's part of the reason why the antitrust laws have stuck around, is because they are very useful to create value in that way.
Unlocking capital that's become complacent, essentially.
Right. Keeping the velocity of money high, keeping money flowing, keeping investments from getting stuck in dead pools where they can't work their way out.
On that note, I think it's about time for the segment. What do you think?
The segment?
The segment.
The infamous segment.
This day in economic history is here. I know the moment you've all been waiting for.
I'm ready for the news of the world. Hit me.
And again, so today's May 2nd. So, going off of May 2nd, even though it's going to be Cinco de Mayo, the time you hear it, honorable mention, I thought the European Central Bank was actually ratified on May 1st, 1998.
Oh.
And then it didn't go into effect until June 1st. So.
You said 1998?
Yeah, 1998.
That's relatively recent. It's less than 30 years old.
Right. But the big story I wanted to mention, and bear with me here, right? I have a longer story to tell here for you. And I've gone digital. I had paper last week, but I've got Notes app. So, on May 2nd, 1670, King Charles II of England granted a royal charter to a company that would come to rule more land than most nations, not symbolically, but literally. That company was the Hudson's Bay Company. And the land it was granted, Rupert's Land, covered nearly 1/12 of all of North America. Let that sink in.
Now, was it one now?
Yeah. A private business was given exclusive rights to govern, trade, tax, and police an area larger than India. The Hudson's Bay Company wasn't just a corporation, it was a shadow government with a logo. For nearly 200 years, it acted as the de facto authority across the vast frozen empire. It passed laws, ran courts, raised militias, and most importantly, controlled the fur trade. In the age of colonialism, Britain didn't just send armies, it sent corporations. And HBC, Hudson Bay Company, was the North American counterpart to the East India Company, a weaponized balance sheet with royal backing. It all began with two French fur traders, Pierre Espery Radisson and his brother-in-law, Medard de Grossier.
Oh, you're butchering the
I'm
French
not even going
language.
to try to pronounce it. I'm just using an American accent. So
okay.
After a wildly successful expedition around Hudson Bay, they returned to Quebec loaded with pelts. But the French authorities fined them for trading without a license, and when they asked for official backing to return by the French government, they were flatly denied. Furious, they took their business idea and their deep geographic knowledge to England. There, they found Prince Rupert of Rupert's Land, cousin of the king, and secured ships, funding, and eventually a royal monopoly. And for a while, it worked perfectly. But monopolies eventually breed resistance. In 1849, the HBC dragged a Matisse trapper, William Sayer, into court, accusing him of illegal fur trading. The courtroom, of course, was staffed by HBC loyalists, but outside, dozens of armed Matisse men gathered, led by Louis Riel Sr. They weren't just there for moral support. Their presence sent a message. The company's monopoly would no longer be enforced uncontested. Though Sayer was found guilty, the judge, under pressure, imposed no penalties, no fines, no prison. It was
guilty, but what an act of legal wizardry. I love rulings like that. Like, I'm ruling this way, but wait, no, actually I'm not. This is fine. Please don't hurt me.
Yeah. It was a symbolic collapse. And with the crowd outside shouting, trade is free, commerce is free, le commerce est libre, HBC's legal stranglehold was finished. By 1869, the British government officially bought Rupert's Land back for 300,000 British pounds, and HBC pivoted to department stores and retail investment, adapting, surviving.
Sorry, it continued to exist.
And this is where this becomes actually relevant to literally this year. So they pivoted, again, to department stores, retail investments. They thrived through the boom of middle-class consumerism. But it wouldn't last, Drew. It wouldn't last. The rise of e-commerce hollowed out its malls. The pandemic dealt the final blow. Just this year, in March 2025, with 6 locations left, HBC filed for creditor protection, and a judge gave it until early May to avoid liquidation. And now, over 350 years later, this once sovereign super corporation stands at the brink, not taken down by revolution, not by war, but by the cold, quiet logic of the internet. And so, May 2nd, on this day, you got to remember, a company once ruled 1/12 of North America, emitted currency, enforced laws, wrote history. But in the end, the empire didn't fall, it logged off.
Did you come up with that? Was that you that wrote that? Was that why we recorded a little bit later today? You were coming up with this one line.
Oh yeah, you got to come up with a good story.
Oh jeez.
But that's crazy, and it's funny. I was reading an article about Hudson's Bay Company going bankrupt yesterday. And then as I was looking for events that happened on May 2nd, I saw that Hudson's Bay Company charter was approved on May 2nd. I'm like, that's crazy.
Poetic. How poetic. Yeah.
But you think about it, the idea that super corporations basically fueled colonialism is kind of crazy.
How cyberpunk of them.
Yeah, it's very similar to what's that game about corporations in space?
Cyberpunk 2077?
No. Outer Worlds.
Oh. I did play that game briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, I think people give corporations a little bit too much credit these days. Like, they're a tool. Most corporations are like single owner entities that are just run by a small business as a sort of liability and separate way of separation. We have several, limited liability companies between us actually here. And sometimes I think people tend to assume that corporation means giant conglomerate that pulls shadowy strings in the background, like the Hudson Bay Company or, the East India Company. And those kinds of companies do exist kind of to a certain extent in some circumstances. But I would say like international, to bring it back, international cartels such as De Beers or OPEC are more relevant.
Yeah, I think people have this fear of quote unquote corporations that are evil, and in reality, most corporations are small businesses.
Yeah, and I feel like people are influenced a little bit too much by pop media and like science fiction stories, which tend to be written by I love science fiction, but sometimes the work is just dripping with a particular political view that the author happens to hold, which is fine. I mean, that's what science fiction is about. It's about exploring the realm of the possible.
But it leads to stupid policy like in Oregon. Don't even get me started on the stupid corporate minimum tax.
I hate that tax.
They campaigned, for those of you that don't know, they campaigned on this idea that, did you know that 70% of LLCs or corporations in Oregon don't pay any tax? Well, we're going to institute this minimum $150 tax. And, well, okay, that's because most corporations either lose money or it's a pass-through. So all the income is reported on personal income taxes and then taxed. So all you've done is create a headache and raise the registration fee for LLCs. And then guess what? They came in and said, did you know that 70% of corporations in Oregon only pay the minimum tax?
I absolutely hate that marketing. I don't fully understand why they were pushing for this. As far as I could tell, it was just a political win. But I did know it was pushed kind of by the unions here in Oregon, which
wasn't it the grocery store union?
I
or
think
something?
It was the grocery store union guys.
They
Those
push a
guys
lot of
are always
weird
pushing.
stuff.
They're always pushing really harebrained ideas. They were trying to push a gross receipts tax, which for those maybe not familiar, Oregon doesn't have like a sales tax. It's one of very few states that doesn't have a sales tax. But what a gross receipts tax on groceries does is all it does is make your groceries more expensive. You know, grocery stores operate on razor thin margins. So it was just like this one activist that got like a really big fire up his whatever to try and take down the big corporation he represented the workers for. So unintended consequences. Tax policy is always very nuanced and never quite as straightforward as you think it is.
Yeah.
So you got to make sure you're not trying to hurt the people you're trying to help. But it is it's all it's all very complicated.
Yeah. But I thought that was an interesting tidbit on the Hudson Bay Company because they extended all the way through Oregon and they had fur trading throughout the Oregon territory.
They did.
And
the first settlers of Oregon, that were at least the first European settlers of Oregon, were fur traders.
yeah.
So they went to what was then called the French Prairie because most of these guys were fur traders from Quebec and Canada that came in to trap the furs and took native wives, and they were basically all men, which is why they had native wives. And then were overwhelmed by the later wave of immigration that came in from elsewhere.
Yeah.
Most of the United States.
Fun fact about French Canada: the same reason when the French were colonizing, it was oftentimes just those men like fur traders.
Yep.
Whereas the English would have more families. And so they would grow actual settlements, whereas the fur traders were not very populous.
Yeah, the English were very fond of their religious persecution, which tended to drive whole groups of people out.
Yeah. So, but the French, in an effort to populate their territory, to stake their claim, rounded up a bunch of ladies of the night in Paris with the promise that they could settle in the New World. Basically, just to go on and marry all the fur traders. So it's I forget what they call them. It's the women that were all women of the night in French Canada.
You mean prostitutes?
Well, yeah, I don't want to get flagged by Spotify.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, we can bleep that. It'll sound funnier anyways. So yeah, the peculiarities of early colonization efforts by European powers of North America. It's, love it, hate it, it happened, and it's resulted in the tapestry of different backgrounds and cultures that we have today.
Yeah. So hopefully you're getting to work right about now and enjoy Cinco de Mayo. But this has been The Capital Call. I'm Quinn Millegan.
And I'm Drew Millegan.
And we'll catch you next week, and we're working on some interviews. But in the meantime, stay liquid.
Stay liquid, my friends.
Oh, yeah.